here, and I want to apologize for the low volume on my last video. Somehow the settings on my microphone gain got set down lower than they should have been, and you know how your computer does that when you haven't even been in there fooling with it. That's just the way of our computers, not only the PC but also the car. This is a little thing about epic failures and some fixes and some other stuff. I had a guy that the human resources director sent me that was a work study student. Told her I needed a work study student and I needed somebody really to do filing and all that. So she sent this great big muscled up guy down there that looked like a football player, and he did not even know how to save a file or anything. He was just not office material. She thought I needed somebody to move heavy stuff around in the shop, I guess. But anyway, I opened the hood on his truck one day when we were in there fooling around with it, and I says, "What happened to your alternator?" And he says, "Well, my truck wouldn't start, and somebody told me to take a hammer and hit the starter, and I thought that was the starter, and when I hit it, it broke." And I said, "Okay, well, before you tell anybody to hit anything with a hammer, I guess we can learn, we need to make sure they know the difference between a starter and an alternator." This guy's pickup had a flat tire one time on the way to do the work he was due for me, and he said, "I can't make it today because I had a flat and I don't have a spare." So me and one of my students got a spare and went over there and changed his tire for him and all that. And when I told him, I says, "Can you pick this tire here up and put it in the back of your truck?" And he basically picked it up with one arm and held it straight out, you know, which was quite a feat. This guy was strong as a bull, but he didn't know anything. He wanted to be a football player, I think, or something. But now this one here is showing this, every single one of these that you see here was because of a lot of current flow heating up the joint and oxidizing it, and resistance making it get hotter and hotter. That happened with this fan relay on this Pontiac, whatever kind of Pontiac SUV. It wasn't a Montana, it was one, a Silhouette, or maybe it was an Oldsmobile Silhouette, whatever it was. But anyway, the fan wouldn't work, and I found this burned out relay and connector. That was a lot of current going to that fan. This is a lot of current going to everything that's in that box. And this ignition switch had a lot of current that was going in. You know, a lot of the times whenever you see a module or a switch or something that's got a lot of current to pull, it will have two wires going into it feeding current and two wires feeding current out, so they can kind of share the load a little bit. And this one here was like that, but it still had enough current to melt the switch. Now, some of these switches on some of the late 80s F-Series pickups would actually leak. I mean, they would begin to catch fire. I saw one time on the front end guy's lift catch fire, and you could see flames licking up behind the windshield. And he had the thing raised up doing an alignment on it, and this happened when it was just sitting there with the key. He may have had the key switched on because he was having to turn the wheels back and forth, but usually you don't have to go all the way to on, you know, but sometimes you go too far when you're just doing the work. This is another fan motor that, you know, started oxidizing the terminal and snowballed and got hotter and hotter and hotter. And this is a really nice late model Hyundai Sonata that was sitting down there in a local parking lot that just for some unknown reason caught fire and burned and got totaled out. Some of the Explorers in the early 90s, like 94 I think, they actually developed a problem with the power mirror switch, believe it or not, in the panel. This guy went and had a cell phone put in an Explorer, and he went from there to another place of business, and while he was in the other place of business, the thing caught fire and burned and totaled the vehicle out. And the investigation revealed that it wasn't anything the cell phone people did. It was a short circuit there at the power mirror switch. And so they had a program on that where we had to, there's a recall where we had to go in there and install an inline fuse and go into that switch to keep that kind of thing from happening. But now this is the blower motor controller. See how it's all burned and scorched. This is another blower speed resistor they do that. Think about this, all of the high current circuits are at risk of doing this. And that's all of this is high current stuff. You don't typically ever see little signal wires that are got hot and burned up unless they caught fire or something else happened to them. But this is something I wanted to make I've taken a lot of pictures of a lot of different makes of cars, and I didn't pull them all together for this, but I've seen any car that you can think of, any make or model of car. As far as I have seen them in all my travels, I look at cars that are sitting beside the road that look like they've been parked and never been driven again. You'll see Fords, Chevys, Dodges, Toyotas, Mercedes. It doesn't matter what brand you come up with. Honda cars, doesn't matter. Nissans. This is a late model Nissan. That's like a 2003 Toyota Camry, which, you know, those are really good cars. But this one here got parked and just, of course, you might say, well, they just parked it and stopped driving it. You know, well, that's kind of extraordinary, but it does happen. This old Ranger sitting there, and that Chevy sitting there. So I don't care what vehicle you're loyal to, there's always somebody that doesn't like whatever brand of vehicle you like, and they'll give you a half a dozen reasons why. And you can usually find one sitting beside the road with weeds growed up around it because they're not driving it anymore. And so, you know, you got an idea that, well, I had trouble with this Dodge, so I'm going to buy a Toyota and I'll never have any trouble with it again. Well, that's not necessarily true, because anything built by the hand of man can give you a problem. Any of it can break down. And, you know, nothing is bulletproof and breakdown proof, no matter who made it or where it came from. Now this right here is a little study in the difference in how you can see something when the light is shining a different way. This blown head gasket, when you're looking straight at it, you can tell that head gasket's blown. It's not that you can't tell it, but if you want to illustrate it so the customer will understand it, if you get over here and you shine the light across it, look how much more pronounced that is than it is over here. And so that's just something you need to, you know, whenever you're looking. And here's another time you can use light to shine across something. You want to make sure you got the gasket scraped off good. The student that did this told me he was through scraping that gasket and was ready to put the water pump on there. And I shined the light across. Of course, you can feel this with your fingers too, but I shined the light across it and showed that to him. Also, you can take a razor blade and finish that off, because this is steel anyway. Got to be careful with aluminum though, because you'll dig a trench in aluminum if you're not really careful. But I like to take, after I'm through with all this, I like to take a piece of sandpaper and sand that off and make it just as smooth and just as flat as I possibly can. Now, if something has warped it so that it's not flat anymore, there's not a whole lot you can do about that except use a really thick gasket and some that, you know, Gorilla Snot yellow stuff. Of course, they make the black 3M weather strip adhesive too. But anyway, that's just an observation on that. Pull it up just a little like we were doing before. Just pull it up and hold it there just a second. And you pull it up just a second. See, it looks a lot different than it did before when you pull it up that throttle angle, doesn't it? And it's not stumbling anymore. We did that job on an older Asian vehicle, Asian make car. I don't remember what it was. It seemed like it was a pickup or something. It was OBD1. There was no scan tool. I don't know if you ever remember those old OBD1. A lot of those Asian cars had an engine controller under the seat, and it had a little hole in the side of it, and you would do something like turn a little screw, a plastic screw slot thing, and it would flash the codes out. And it only could put out about 8 or 9 codes. And this was one of those kind, and the codes didn't tell you much of anything. So I scoped this one when it was stumbling, and you know, the rule of thumb is whatever is in the most hostile environment and is doing the most work is what's going to fail first. That's my rule of thumb. Now that's usually the way it is. Fuel tank sending unit is always moving, always doing the work. It's typically what's going to wear out. Now that's not true 100% of the time, but you can pretty well say it's a good chance that whatever's working the hardest and is in the most hostile environment is what's going to fail. This trace here, believe it or not, was on a Toyota Tacoma right here, and we was scoping that one right there. That scope I was using was one of those old Intero PDA scopes, and I loved that thing, but it died and I couldn't get it fixed anywhere, and you couldn't buy another one. But it had a drawback or two, but that was an incredibly high resolution scope whenever I was using it. Now this little scope pattern right here on this misfiring cylinder, look at that. That's when it charges up the coil. This is when it fires it. That's supposed to be straight up and come down and have a little firing line and then have this leftover energy down here. This one wasn't like that, and the deal was there was enough resistance inside this plug that it was jumping down the outside of the plug and finding an easier place to go. Now plugs are supposed to have, you know, from 3,000 to 8,000 ohms of resistance in here anyway, but this one here had so much resistance and it was so hard to fire down here on the tip that it was flashing over and running down the side. They put these bumps on here, you know, whenever they, I like the ones with the bumps better because they don't gall themselves to the plug wires bad. GM had some that were downright smooth. And on those, if you were going to replace the plugs, you may as well sell them a set of plug wires too, because about half the time you're pulling the plug wire off, it's going to rip the thing off all to pieces. But anyway, that's the scope pattern, and this is the cylinder 2 and cylinder 3 misfires. But we actually went to cylinder 2 and found this, and the cylinder 3 issue wasn't as easy to illustrate as this one, but I just wanted to show you that. And this right here is the air conditioner on this vehicle would start cooling, and then as it kept cooling, the cooling would go away. Well, the condenser fan wasn't working, as I remember, or it might have been clogged up with all kind of fuzz and grass and stuff between the radiator and the condenser. You know, because that grass and fuzz and stuff will go right through the condenser, and it'll stop when it gets to the radiator so that you can't see it. And there's no airflow across that condenser. The low side is going to be high, and the high side is going to be high. This is insanely high. This is close to, you know, the pop-off valve on the compressor's level to pop off. But this ought to be down somewhere in this general area, and this ought to be down somewhere around here. So this is a whole lot higher. Watch those pressures. That's just one example of that. I could do more with AC pressures, but that's all I'm going to show you right now. Now this right here was a job I was given to do when I was working down in Texas in the late 70s on this big pipe loader that had a 24-volt system. It was a International Huff, and they wanted to put headlights on it because the place ran 24 hours a day, and sometimes they couldn't see what they were doing at night. And so I couldn't find any 24-volt bulbs at the time, so what I did was I got two 12-volt headlight bulbs, mounted them, and I basically wired them up so that they were running in series. You might notice we had 24 volts here because there were two batteries that were wired together like you see right here. Whenever you turn on the headlight switch, the current had to flow through this headlight and that headlight to get to ground, which meant they were splitting this 24 volts two ways, and that worked really well. The only problem is if you blow this one, you lose them both. So you got to figure out which one is blown. If both of them quit working, just one of the lights. See, if each one had its own ground, of course they blow right away because they can't burn on 24 volts. You know, I could have put a resistor in there or something like that, but this right here was the simplest way to make that happen. And I had to do a lot of engineering like that when I was working on heavy equipment down there. Now this was an Explorer that the student didn't have a lot of money. He didn't want to buy an entire clutch kit. All he really wanted to do was replace the clutch disc. So say only place you could buy a clutch disc by itself was the Ford place. So we got one from the Ford place and we put it in there, And that, see, before it was slipping. After we put this clutch in there, the thing wouldn't fully release. I mean, when you went to put it in gear, you could mash the clutch and hold it and wait a second and try to put it in gear. It was still turning the transmission input shaft, and it would grind and trying to go into gear. And we worked on that thing, pulled it out of 3 or 4 times, trying to figure it out, and I even put the pressure plate in a press with the bearing on it, pushing down to see if it was fully releasing and all that. At the end of the story was that new clutch disc that we bought from the Ford place had a lateral run out. When you turn this thing through on that shaft with it, all you were doing was turning it through, this needle would move. And it seems to me like it was about 50 or 60 thousandths of an inch. What that amounted to was part of that disc was always touching the pressure plate on one side, and on the opposite side it was always touching the flywheel. Even when the clutch was supposed to be fully released, that was turning the input shaft, that was making it grind. And we fixed that by getting them to send us another disc, measured it, it didn't have any lateral run out, and that took care of that problem. Now this right here is the chewed up oxygen sensor. This lady that was a computer science instructor, her dog just made an absolute mess out of this oxygen sensor. And one time, the first time it wasn't quite this bad, and we fixed it by just patching the wires. The second time it was so bad we couldn't fix it. It was like a dog was trying to one-up us or something. And so we replaced the oxygen sensor, which basically had to go up through the floor pan, and the connector was inside under the seat. And then we put a big piece of steel, bent a piece of steel to fit, and so that it would be bolted up here where there was no way on earth that dog could get to that oxygen sensor, and that was the end of that problem. And there weren't any other wires he could reach. These balancers, has got rubber in between the inside and the outside. And when that rubber starts to deteriorate and it lets that outside move, if the timing marks are on the outside, it gives you all kinds of a problem. If you don't if this doesn't agree with this and your timing marks are out of line, it'll also cause, and once this starts to move around, because this is a balancer, it will cause engine vibrations and stuff like that. So look for that rubber. Some of the Explorers, that rubber will fail and the thing will slide back, and I've seen 2 times in 1 week I saw Explorers do that, but I hadn't seen one since. I'm sure other people have seen them, where the balancer comes apart, the outside slides in, and it destroys the crank sensor. That one made it quit beside the road or something like that. But it goes far enough back to where the belt will come off of the pulley grooves and try to ride on this center naked hub. It's a crazy thing. Now this is one on that Ford Fusion I've talked about a time or two before. The evaporator temperature was lying about what the temperature was, and it was freezing up. You could tell with all this frost, and that frost was also gathering on the evaporator. And the register temperature was 21 degrees. But it was reading this, and we replaced the sensor, like that usually causes them not to work at all, but we did all kinds of stuff trying to fix this, and the lady wouldn't ever let me keep the vehicle long enough to actually dig into it and find it. But I found out that there were other 2012 Ford Fusions that had been at dealerships, and they stayed there 2 or 3 weeks trying to figure out this problem, couldn't figure out what was wrong with it. So it was one of those wacky situations that doesn't happen on every 2012 Ford Fusion, but if it ever does start doing that, I was frustrated because I didn't get to a fix on this to tell what it was that it really needed, but that's the breaks of the ball game. This was an adapter I made so that I could hook our transmission flush machine up to a 2004 Mercedes that the president of the college had, and he was telling me when he bought that vehicle used that the transmission fluid, according to what the owner's manual said, was lifetime transmission fluid and never needed to be changed. Well, he'd been driving it a year or two, and then he told me, he says, this thing's not shifting like it's supposed to, and the transmission's acting funny. I says, well, buy the fluid that's supposed to go in it from the Mercedes dealer, and we'll do a fluid flush. Now, you had to buy, more fluid than it took, because we went ahead and flushed it, and then we actually did a transmission service and changed the filter. But changing the fluid fixed that, and this was the adapter in my kit. I mean, my machine didn't have an adapter to fit this, so I had to build one. But there was a Cadillac, like a '05 Cadillac, came in there not shifting right, and the transmission fluid in that one literally looked like brake fluid. I mean, it was black. I was thinking, what in the world is this? I've never seen that before. Well, I did a transmission full fluid exchange on that one and fixed it. Didn't have to do anything except do a fluid exchange and then change the, filter and pan gasket and all, and make sure it was full of fluid when it left. And that, we fixed several like that. This right here, this flywheel broke, and the guy just kept driving it. And this was supposed to, the center of this flywheel is supposed to support that torque converter, but because it didn't have any support, it destroyed that. Now, I've seen these things crack before. It'll throw you for a loop, making you think you got a transmission pump seal leaking when it's leaking around this nose. The first time I saw that was at the Lincoln Mercury place in 1984. Now this right here is what happens when somebody's under there working on the wire or putting a hood release cable or something like that, and they don't put this grommet back in place. And they don't put the grommet back in place. The customer comes back and says, now that you've worked on my car, it came a big rain last night and my driver's floorboard is full of water. And so then when you get under there and see this, somebody dropped the ball. Of course the mechanic, if he's not very experienced, will say, well, I didn't do anything to cause that, but this is what caused that, and it was because one of my guys was under there working on the wire harness and they accidentally unseated that grommet. Those grommets need to be in place, like you see that one right there. Any grommet that's out of place, if that plug's missing, you're going to have some issues right there. And we ran water and saw it dripping and followed it with a light, and that's what it led us to. Now, anytime you're doing any kind of work where you got a jack screw is putting a lot of load, power steering, pump, pulley replacement, whatever, always put grease on these threads. If you don't put grease on those threads, you're going to put out a whole lot more effort than you need to. Putting that grease on there makes the job go a lot smoother, and I had to teach my students that very diligently. So we grease those threads really good, and then you could pop that ball joint out of there with no problem at all. This is something that the first time I ever ran into this was when I was on wheat harvest in 1975 or 6, whenever it was, I think it was 75, because I went on 2 wheat harvests. I was told by the boss man to change the oil in my Alice Chalmers combine. And the 2 oil filters on that engine were down between the grain hopper and the engine, and you could barely get to them. And they were huge oil filters. And we had to use a strap wrench that had with an extension that would wind up. And so I screwed both those filters off. Of course, it didn't help that I had some food poisoning because I had made myself some chili and didn't cook it good enough. But I told him, I said, I don't feel like doing anything. He said, you need to get out here and walk that off, So anyway, when I took that oil filter off and I put the other one back on, unbeknownst to me, the gasket had stayed on that doggone thing. And as soon as I started up oil, whatever, I switched it off right away. And that all had to be straightened out later on. But since then, you see these gaskets stick. And I always told my people, when you're doing an oil change, when you screw that oil filter off, you look at that thing. If you don't know where that gasket is, or if it's not there, you find that gasket. Because if it's somewhere it's not supposed to be, you're going to have some serious issues, and it could be an engine destroying proposition. And so I took several pictures of gaskets that had stuck when the filter came off. Now this one here, they made it red rubber. I don't know, maybe so you could spot it easier. I don't really know about that. Well, I got power steering pump pulley issues here. Now this is on my pickup. Popped without I was on the way to the eye doctor the other day, and I lost my power steering, and I lost my air conditioning, and I lost my alternator. And of course I had to struggle to get it over there. When I get out and open the hood, this pulley has popped right around the middle. I don't know that I've ever seen that happen in my whole 40 plus years in this industry. But I had the tools, but I called the Ford place to start with. It's obsolete. You can't get it from Ford anymore. I called the Advanced Auto Parts, $66. I called, but they didn't have it. I called Napa store. they didn't give me a price, but they said they couldn't have it until the following week. I needed it that day. So I called O'Reilly's. They had one on the shelf for 66 bucks. I went and bought it. I already had the tool to pull it off and put it back on. But when I was pressing it back on, it got almost all the way back on and it stopped. Of course, it's not hurting anything because that power steering pump pulley's got a little bit of play. But the end of that story was that thing just totally surprised me. I actually limped it back home by switching it off, coasting down hills and watching my temperature and all that after the thing broke. But I fixed it that very same day. I managed to, had to pull the fan off and the fan shroud and all that stuff, and got that fixed. Now look for your tires to have an issue like this. Sometimes you'll see several smaller bumps like this evenly spaced around there, and that's not generally a problem. But if you see one that big as it casts a shadow, or if you see how that's coming out of the bead, that's tire issues. You need to catch that, warn them about it, send them to the tire store or something, you know, because there's issues going to be happening here. This was a Jeep that we put valve cover gaskets on, and this dowel is real stubborn and tries to hold on to the valve cover gasket and doesn't want to let it come off. And Tim, the boy that was doing this, he managed to crack that valve cover just a little bit, but he didn't think it was going to be a problem because it was still, looked like it was still pressing on the gasket. But it came back with this little dab of a leak, and it was coming out here, and it was dripping off there, and every now and then it would hit the exhaust and there'd be a little smoke and you'd smell it. And of course the guy that owned it says, "Oh no, it's going to set fire to my Jeep. It's just not safe to drive." I'm not saying we didn't need to fix it, but he overblew that, saying it wasn't safe to drive and it was going to catch fire. But we had to replace the valve cover. These valve covers are very thin on those late model V6 Jeeps and annoyingly easy to break, particularly because they like to stick to that dowel whenever you're pulling them out of there. Well, that's all I got today. I got 25 minutes into this thing. I hope you guys enjoyed it and got something out of it. And hit a like on this thing, share it with some friends, and let me know what you think about it. I'll talk to you next week.